12-year-old Emily and her mother were spending Christmas Eve together at home. Since her father had left them, her mother had done everything she could to make the holidays special. At around 2 a.m., Emily woke up to a strange rustling noise. It was coming from the kitchen. Still half asleep, she tiptoed down the hallway. In the dim light, she saw a dark figure hunched over the kitchen counter, rummaging through the cabinets. A long knife gleamed in his hand. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The man hadn't noticed her yet. Moving as silently as possible, she backed away and rushed to her room, throwing the covers over herself. She barely had time to process what was happening when she heard her mother scream. Her heart pounded as she bolted out of bed. She ran to her mother's room and froze. The intruder was standing over her mother, pressing a hand over her mouth. He slowly turned his head and locked eyes with Emily. Then he brought a finger to his lips. Shh! Emily's body trembled with terror. She didn't know what to do. Then suddenly, bang, bang, bang. The front door rattled as someone pounded on it. A voice shouted from outside, "Police! Open up!" The man's head jerked toward the door. In a split second, he bolted for the back of the house. Emily rushed to open the door, and within seconds, armed officers swarmed inside. They tackled the intruder and cuffed him. As they dragged him past Emily, he shot her a look filled with pure hatred. Later, the police discovered he was a former tenant who had once lived in the basement. Somehow, he had kept a spare key. If the neighbors hadn't called the police after spotting a shadowy figure sneaking into the house, no one knew what might have happened. From that night on, Emily made sure to check every door and window 3 times before going to bed. And she never forgot the cold grip of fear or the gleam of that knife in the darkness. On Christmas Eve in 2019, Mark sat alone in his small apartment, watching the snowfall outside. The flakes grew heavier, blanketing everything in white. It was 1:18 a.m. He took a sip of his warm coffee when he suddenly heard a faint but distinct knock at his door. Who could be visiting at this hour? He got up and opened the door, but no one was there. The only thing he noticed was a fresh set of footprints leading away from his doorstep under the dim streetlight. Shaking his head, he closed the door, thinking probably just the wind or some prank. But 5 minutes later, the knock came again. Mark hesitated, a strange unease creeping over him. He opened the door once more. Still, there was no one. Frustrated, he shut it and peered through the peephole, waiting. A third knock. This time, he yanked the door open instantly. A small child, no older than 7 or 8, was sprinting across the street toward an old abandoned house. Mark had never paid attention to that place before, but now he was curious. Why was a child outside in the freezing cold at this hour? The next morning, unable to shake his curiosity, Mark walked over to the house and knocked. No answer. He tried again in the evening. Still nothing. Something felt off. He tested the door, and to his surprise, it wasn't locked. As soon as he stepped inside, the putrid stench of decay hit him. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture looked untouched for years. He slowly climbed the staircase, feeling an inexplicable dread. 5 doors lined the upper hallway. The first room he checked was nearly empty, just an old bed and a broken wardrobe. The other rooms were much the same. A total waste of time, he thought. But just as he turned to leave, he felt a soft tap on his shoulder. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with a gaunt woman, her hollow eyes locked onto his. She pressed a finger to her lips and whispered, "Shh." Mark's blood ran cold. He stumbled backward, but the woman took a step closer. "Don't come back," she murmured. Terrified, Mark bolted down the stairs and out the front door. As he ran home, a piercing scream echoed behind him. "Come back!" That night, at exactly 3 a.m., he jolted awake to the sound of soft tapping on his window. Heart pounding, he hesitated before pulling the curtain aside. The same woman stood outside, her pale face stretched into an unnatural, ear-to-ear grin. Mark fell back in horror and immediately called 911. The police arrived quickly, but when they searched the abandoned house, they found no signs of anyone living there. One of the officers pulled him aside and said, "That house, a woman and her child, were brutally murdered there years ago. The case is still unsolved." From that night on, Mark swore he would never forget her face. No matter how much therapy he underwent, the image of her twisted smile remained seared into his mind. Ethan lived alone in a secluded mountain town in Minnesota. He had invited his family over for Christmas Eve dinner, and they were due to arrive in a few hours. Wanting to warm up the house, he decided to gather firewood from the nearby woods. At around 7 p.m., he stepped outside. Darkness had already settled, and thick snowflakes blurred the landscape. As he walked toward the tree line, an eerie feeling crept over him, like he was being watched. He shook it off. "It's just your imagination." But as he bent down to pick up a log, a blood-curdling scream echoed from deep within the woods. He froze. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, neither human nor animal. Slowly, he turned around. 2 sets of footprints ran parallel to his own in the snow. His breath caught in his throat. Someone had been walking alongside him the entire time. Panic surged through him. He dropped the wood and sprinted back to his house, slamming and locking the door behind him. His chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing. An hour later, his family arrived. He chose not to mention what had happened. He didn't want them to think he was losing his mind from living alone. But later that night, long after everyone had gone to bed, he heard a whisper outside his window. "You found me." Ethan slowly turned his head, his pulse hammering in his ears. Through the frost-covered glass, he saw a pale face pressed against the window, staring at him. From that night forward, he never ventured into the woods after dark again.